Welcome. Hello. I'd like to welcome everyone to this presentation about the Interfaith Trip to Israel as part of our Congregational Life series, Broadening Horizons. What fun that we get to travel to Israel today, even when we can't really travel to Israel right now. Today, we will enjoy slides and stories of the trip to Israel from some of the trip participants, followed by a time for you to ask the participants questions. For the Q&A, please use the Q&A written questions feature in Zoom to ask your questions. You can submit your written questions at any time, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. Also, during Q&A, you may use gallery view to see all of the panelists together. I'd like to welcome first the trip leaders, or two of the trip leaders, Reverend Larry Hayward and Rabbi Jack Molin, who are joining us today with a special happy birthday hello to Jack. Happy birthday to you. I hope you brought your own cake. Sorry, I can't give that to you over Zoom. Maggie Hayward and Ann Molin were unable to join us today, unfortunately. And now I'd like to introduce Eric and Sheila Weiss, who has taken the lead on organizing this program to coordinate the slides and talk with several other trip participants. And I'll hand it over to Sheila now.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I wanted to tell everybody that we all bonded so well. We have such a great panel of people and we became good friends. We shared information, and the people I'm talking about are Judy Gray, Nedra Trahant, Janet Hawkins, David Wormser, Dana Van Beaver Green, and Judith Van Beaver Green. And now I would like to turn it over to Larry Hayward, who will open us with a prayer.
Okay, let us pray. Dear God, we gather as a community that formed in this country and in Israel 6 months ago, in what sometimes seems 6 years or even 6 decades ago. Yet community we were then and community we are now. And for the blessing of communities everywhere, we dare to pray this day. Amen.
Thank you very much, Larry. Well, I'd like to say welcome to everyone who's with us, friends and family and everybody who wanted to have a look at this wonderful trip that we had. And we're so happy to be here today to share some of our memories of our wonderful trip. And there were 68 of us, some from Westminster, some from Megiddo, Sakin, and others. Depending on how you count it, it was 9 or 10 days of traveling. It took about 14 hours to get from Dulles to Tel Aviv via Istanbul. And believe me when I tell you that it was really hard to pare down all the thousands of pictures and so many memories. They say 2 heads are better than 1, but there were 8 of us putting our heads together to make this presentation, and I hope we've chosen the best highlights. We all felt God's hand in many ways, not the least of which was we arrived after a lot of flooding in Israel and just before COVID-19 changed everything. Since we only have an hour, we better get started. And so I will introduce Judy Gray, who's going to give an introduction to the program.
Good morning or good afternoon, I guess. Wonderful memories this presentation will spark. I know I can speak for everyone on the trip when I say that while the planners hit it out of the park, for me, this trip would not have been as moving and memorable without the commentary and humor of our guides, Karen and Sheila. The sharing among old and new friends, and especially the overlay that was provided by Jack and Ann and Larry and Maggie. Some things were outstanding, or some of the memories are outstanding to me, such as the Bible readings at the sites, the beautiful song on the bus, and Jack's service when we were entering Jerusalem, Larry and Maggie's Sunday service, which gave us time for reflection, Jack and Ann's talk with us after our visit to Yad Vashem, the celebration of Shabbat, and the wonderful words and very funny stories that we shared at the farewell dinner. This trip greatly deepened my appreciation of our Christian and Jewish heritage, and I will never forget it, and I'm dying to go again.
Thank you, Judy. Okay. So Eric, can we start with day one?
I'm sorry, it's not working for me now. Would somebody enable screen sharing for me?
Eric, it's enabled.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed the button.
There we go. All
Okay.
right. Okay, so this is sort of our cover sheet here. Now, we need to go to the map. Please, honey. This is day one and the next map. There we go, that one. All right. So this covers the first 4 days of our trip, starting in Tel Aviv at the bottom. And then we went to Caesarea, which is on the coast there. Then to Nazareth, which is inland. And then to our hotel, just a few miles from the border with Lebanon. You'll also note that Syria is quite close. The Golan Heights and the Sea of Galilee are also very close by. To give you a little perspective, Israel is about the size of New Jersey. You'll also notice that a big chunk of Israel is marked West Bank. Tourist buses were generally allowed through the checkpoints with no hassle. Others had to show ID. Oh, Eric, please go back one. Okay, so we arrived at Ben Gurion Airport at 7:15 p.m., had a late dinner, and then we stayed at the Dan Panorama Tel Aviv. And this is the view from our room. You can see that we're looking out on the Mediterranean. The next one, please. Good. All right, this is right on the coast, just across the street from the hotel. Beautiful view of someone running and the Mediterranean again. All right, so this is our first day traveling. We had 2 buses for our tour, and we boarded them after breakfast. Here we are. We're all eager to start our adventure, getting on the buses, right? We drove along the Mediterranean to the ancient city of Caesarea. And so we were riding along on the bus, they pointed out that when we pass a little town, if you see a minaret, you'll know that it's a Muslim town. So you can see the minaret on the hillside there, and that's a Muslim town that we were passing. Okay, this is the entrance to Caesarea. Caesarea was built by King Herod the Great and was once the seat of Roman rule. And it's a national park in Israel. This is the amphitheater, which is in beautiful condition. And this was part of King Herod's palace, and that you see there in front is what used to be a freshwater pool, and people had to carry the water to there because it's on the saltwater ocean, but they carried fresh water there because apparently Herod didn't like to get salty. Okay, and this is the rest of Caesarea. You can see looking down the coast. Okay, then we continue to the Community Art Gallery at Al-Fahem, founded in 1996 by Syed Abu Shakra as an initiative of local residents and artists who wanted to bring quality contemporary art to the city and exhibit original Arab and Palestinian art. With the lack of other art galleries in the Arab sector in Israel, the gallery has become an important social and cultural meeting place. And this is a group of teenagers. They have programs for teenagers in the art gallery, and they were walking through. Next, we went to Megiddo. It's the site of the Armageddon battlefield, where archaeologists have unearthed more than 20 levels of civilization. And you can see some of the excavations there. Then we went to Nazareth with a stop at Mount Precipice for a grand view of the Jezreel Valley and of Jesus' own hometown. Larry and Maggie read scripture with the Jezreel Valley in the background. By the way, I was very surprised to hear that Nazareth is a Muslim town, although it does have at least one Christian church that we saw, and you'll see the pictures of that in a minute. This is walking through the Nazareth marketplace to the Church of the Annunciation. And that's the front of the church, the entrance. This is an altar inside the church. And we all waited in line to see some of the artifacts and where they believe Mary was when the angel appeared to her. This is a beautiful statue of Mary outside in the courtyard. This is our hotel, the Hagoshrim Hotel. It was a tourist kibbutz, which apparently is very common. It has beautiful grounds that were just a few miles from the border with Lebanon. It was a great place to stay because it was so close to the Sea of Galilee and other interesting must-see places. All right, time for day 2. All right, on day 2, we began our day in Safed, and that is Safed there on the hillside. It's the birthplace of Kabbalah and one of the 4 holy cities according to tradition. You can see that it's took a bit of climbing. It was way up on the hill, so that's going down, right? And we met David Friedman, who was born in Denver, Colorado. He was raised in a modern Orthodox family and immigrated to Israel in 1977. He studied the Torah for 2 years and began his artwork in an attempt to integrate the Torah and art. He explained how Kabbalah can be embedded in art. And okay.
What do you want, Sheila?
I was going to show some pictures, but I'm not on the screen yet, so it's okay. Just forget it. Okay, so when we were in Safed, we walked through and saw several artist workshops and galleries, and we went inside an Ashkenazi synagogue, and that's Shira, our guide, standing there. Then we went to Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus revealed his mission to his disciples. Here it was very evident that there was flooding. And there's Larry talking to us about Jesus and the significance of Caesarea Philippi. And there is the river. It was very full. After that, we went to lunch at the Golan Heights Winery. We had lunch and a wine tasting. It was fantastic. Very nice facilities, and they were, the wine was in barrels, which is kind of unusual. All right, and then we traveled to Mount Ben Tal, where you can see former Israeli army bunkers and learn about the battle that took place here during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. You can also take in views into Syria in the valley below. Mary Eisen spoke to us on an overlook at Mount Ben Tal, but honestly, it was so cold and windy, I didn't hear much of what she said. Generally, she was talking about the difficulties of Syrian refugees. We saw a lot of bunkers driving through the Golan Heights and were told that the entire area was loaded with landmines and uninhabitable. Mount Hermon is the only mountain in Israel with snow all year long. Okay, Day three. Day three was my favorite day of the trip. We visited several Christian holy sites around the Sea of Galilee. Is Nedra here?
I got on.
Excellent, Nedra. Oh, good.
Yes.
I'm so glad.
Surprise.
Yay. All right. So you
Okay.
came just in time.
Yes.
Go for it.
The third day, as Sheila said, we got on we went on the Jesus boat, and it's called that because of the fact that it was designed like the boats that Jesus and the disciples used to use. Our boat happened to be named Reuben, so not sure why. The second day, after we got on the boat, let's see, I think there's another picture here.
Yeah, there's more. Yeah.
Right. As we got on the boat, as you'll see that there's an American flag on the right and the Israeli flag on the left. And as we took off out onto the sea, they began to play the Star-Spangled Banner. And after they did that, they then played the Israeli national anthem. And it was really very moving. And then after we got settled, Larry did a reading and told us a little bit more about where we were and what we were doing. And then we were served these wonderful little treats, and they were given to us by one of our bus drivers. I don't know which one, but they were in honor of the fact that he had just had another grandchild that was born very, very shortly, maybe the day before, I'm not sure. So that was really fun. But then it got really crazy. Everybody kind of took to dancing. I think some of you will recognize Evangeline there, and she's dancing with Kieran, who is one of the guides. And then the floor got crowded. We were taught how to do the hora to Nava Tequila, and it was having a gila, sorry about that. And it was wonderful. It was just so much fun just to be dancing on the ship, and it really was a great end to a great experience. I think that's it.
Okay, is that the last bit? Okay, so then we went into the museum, which we walked through to get to the boat. But this is the Yigal Alan Museum, and we saw a first-century boat which was discovered on the banks of the Sea of Galilee. Then we went to Tabgha, which is a traditional site of the miracle of the loaves and fishes. There's a lovely church there. We saw lots and lots of mosaics. There's an altar in the church. And on the banks of the river here, people were picking up rocks because that is the traditional place where Jesus asked his disciples to follow him. We went to Kinneret Cemetery and saw the graves of many soldiers who died in the Israeli army. Then we went to Magdala, which is an ancient city on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, believed to be the birthplace of Mary Magdalene. And there's a lot of excavation going on there, as there is all over Israel, and many things being unearthed or ruins. And some beautiful mosaics that they uncover. This is a chapel. In the background, you see the boat, and that window looks out on the Sea of Galilee. In the center is a beautiful, we were in an atrium, and while we were there, we got a big surprise when Molly Roden led others in singing Dona Nobis Pacem, which means give us peace. You want to try it again, Eric?
Okay.
Eric, sorry, Eric, if
Yeah.
you, Nancy here, if you make sure you're sharing your computer sound as well as your screen on this screen.
I'm not sure how to do that.
Oh, yeah, it's when you share the screen. I don't know, though, whether you have to, it's in the share the screen square. And,
I can restart it. Let me try that.
while you're doing that, Sheila, yeah, I think your camera just needs to be adjusted the angle.
Camera. Okay. All right. That's one. All right. Believe me, that was worth waiting for. Okay, so this is a small this is in the same church that we were just looking at where people were singing. It's a small chapel. Okay, then we went to Capernaum, and it's an ancient Jewish city with the remains of an ancient synagogue. It was the base of Jesus' Galilean ministry. And the ruins there were quite large and well maintained. And on our way, just in the distance, I happened to snap this picture of this beautiful little chapel alongside the road. Okay, day 4. We're going to look at one more map. We left the Hagoshrim. We drove down the eastern side of Jerusalem, Israel, and we were driving along the Jordan River. The other side, sweetie. All the way up. There you go. That's it. And the Dead Sea is at the bottom there, and kind of in the middle is Jerusalem, and that was our where we were going. The lower third of Israel is mountains and desert. Okay, so this is the day that we drove to Jerusalem. We visited the ancient remains of Beit Shean, which is up just after we left Hagoshrim. And it's a city where Saul and his sons were hung up on the city walls by the Philistines. We toured one of the biggest excavated sites in Israel with its bathhouse, and it had a cardo, and a cardo is a Roman term used for a road into town with columns on either side. And there's more mosaics. All right, and on our way to Jerusalem, we stopped at Genesis Land, where we had a great Bedouin-style lunch in a tent, and that's our guide, and we had camel rides afterward. But that's the kibbutz where the people who run Genesis Land live. Some people were really excited about riding on camels. And here we are, a bunch of us on the camels. A couple more people. And let me tell you, I don't know which is worse, getting on the camel or getting off. All right, so here we are arriving in Jerusalem. We looked at the city from the Mount of Olives across the valley. And that's olive trees in the foreground there. We stayed at the Herbert Samuel Hotel in Jerusalem. And this is a little side street by the hotel that we walked down quite a bit to get the bus and for other reasons too. That evening, there was a tour of the street art appearing every night on the shop's pull-down shields. And that's just two examples. Most of the shields had art on them. So we start with day 5. We toured the city of David, where some of the newest and most exciting excavations of Jerusalem during the time of the first temple are ongoing. And here we are getting ready to go into the city of David. There's some of the excavations of the city. Street musician. That's a lyre. And a beautiful minaret in glass there.
Menorah.
Menorah, I beg your pardon. Not menorah. And we spent the rest of the day touring the old city. This is part of the excavation of the Cardo. They only went so far because they didn't want to tear down people's houses, which is nice. There's an explanation of what a Cardo is. And we went through the Armenian and Jewish quarters and the market. Lots of things in the market. Lots of people too. Yeah, I was a little surprised to see Alabama, Roll Tide. All right, so then we went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it was pretty crowded, as you can see. When we got inside, this is the place, the sepulchre is where Jesus is believed to have been laid after he was hung on the cross and died. And people would go in and pray, kiss it, pay homage. This is one of the stations of the cross. We saw those periodically walking through Jerusalem. This is the Wailing Wall. This is the men's side. And this is the women's side of the Wailing Wall. It wasn't very crowded. We all got to go up and touch it. Put in prayers. Some Orthodox Jewish men in traditional dress. There's a guy in a hat called a spodik, which is a tall fur hat, and they wear it on Shabbat and Jewish holidays. Then we went back to the hotel, and Colonel Grisha Yakubovich talked to us. He's a policy and strategy advisor on the Israeli-Palestinian relations, which translates into West Bank things. He explained how Israel still works to assist Arab farmers who need to reach their fields, passing through the security barrier, which was erected to ensure the safety of Israelis and to preserve the dignity of Arabs. We noticed, Eric noticed that the room where we met was a bomb shelter, and you can see all the locks on the door. At the end of the day, Rabbi Jack Molin led the group in a Shabbat ceremony. It's very nice. So next is day 6. The whole day, the whole city of Jerusalem was basically closed for Shabbat, the Sabbath Shabbat. And so the tour took us outside the city, and we went to Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in ceramic jars. That's a lovely view from Qumran. Another view. There's a cave. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in ceramic jars in 11 different caves, I'm told. And that's one more of Qumran. And next we have Janet and David Wormser and Janet Hawkins to talk about Masada. Take it away.
Thank you, Sheila.
Sure.
When Sheila offered the opportunity to speak on anything regarding the trip, we chose Masada for its importance in Jewish history and folklore. It didn't hurt that it gave us stunning views of the countryside and the Dead Sea, and it was our only cable car ride. Masada was a mountaintop fortress built in 30-something BC by the Roman king Herod the Great, the same Herod that built Caesarea, and the father of the Herod of the New Testament. It's famous because of a group of more than 900 Jews who fled there between 66 and 70 AD after the failure of a Jewish rebellion against Roman rule. They were safe there until 73 AD, when Roman legions, having captured the rebels everywhere else, laid siege to the fortress. Over the course of a few months, the Romans built a huge ramp to the top and battered their way in. Legend has it that when the Romans entered the fort, they found 960 Jews had killed each other, with the last of them committing suicide, rather than allow themselves to be taken as slaves or tortured to death. Remember, these are the same Romans that executed people by crucifixion. It's hard to tell from the pictures, but it's a terrific defensive location, tall mountain with very steep sides. For those that hike to the top, it's a 2.5 hours on a steep and winding snake trail. By contrast, our cable car ride was a densely packed 3 minutes, taking us almost all the way to the top and eventually back down again. Even if we'd heard of social distancing at the time, there was no chance. The place was truly amazing. The ruins are extensive and fascinating, and the views are really spectacular. Sheila?
Thank you, David. That's great. All right.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Oh, and there, I think that's a picture from Masada, if I'm not mistaken. And it looks like you can see the Dead Sea from there. All right. Excavations and more mosaics. Amazing. All right. Okay. So Eric was trying out the Dead Sea to see if you really do float, and it appears that you do. And I'm told also that the Israelis call it the Salty Sea, not the Dead Sea. All right. All right, we're at day 7. On day 7, we visited Yad Vashem, the first and most famous memorial to those who died in the Holocaust. Pictures weren't allowed, but I found a few online. This is the outside of it. This is a picture of a memorial to the 1.5 million children who died in the Holocaust. And this is the Hall of Names. Pictures of victims were inside that dome, and as you walked around, the walls had their names written. This is the hallway, and off on each side you can see doorways, and there are exhibits on each of those sides. And believe me, it was really crowded. It was not nearly as empty as that looks. And now we will hear from Judith Van Beaver.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you, Judy.
I asked to speak about this woman who spoke with us at Yad Vashem after we had toured the museum. The Yad Vashem tour was very, very moving, and this woman was a survivor of the Shoah, which is something that we call the Holocaust. It's a word that means catastrophe or disaster. And her name is Bert Badifi. I think part of the reason that I wanted to speak about the survivor is for some context, because we hear a lot about the Middle East and we hear a lot about Israel, but it's important to have the context that the state of Israel was established in 1948, and it was very shortly after the end of the Second World War and after the end of the Shoah. And whatever we think or conclude about the politics and the events that go on now, it's very important to understand that it was essential at that time to have a place for survivors to go and to be safe. And that's why I think that this was so important. So this woman, Bert Badifi, was French. And she lived with her parents. And as things began to get worse in the center part of France and the cities, her parents sent her out into a more rural area of France to be safe. And she lived with a family there and, stayed safely with them, developed relationships with them. And she told a story that during her stay, her mother came to visit her. I think they lived in Paris. I'm not my memory isn't positive of that. But anyway, her mother came by train to visit her in this rural area, this farming area where she was living with this family. And they were having tea, and some German soldiers pulled up to the home. And it was terrifying for them. And the woman who was their host stepped outside and talked with the soldiers and prevented them from getting into the house, because Bert Badifi said that if they had been discovered by the soldiers, that she and her mother would have been arrested. And later, after the war was over, she remained in touch with this family. And after the woman died, long after, Bert Badifi and her family nominated this woman who had hosted her as one of the righteous. She was honored by the state of Israel. She moved to Israel after the war, and I think that's where she met her husband. And she told us that the joy of her life after the war was, of course, her family, her children and her grandchildren. And she told a very moving story of how her grandson was in the military. All Israelis join the military when they are of a certain age, both boys and girls, and they serve a term in the military. And her son was in the her grandson, excuse me, was in the military. And there was an action, and he was in a tank, and he came to see, he came out of the tank, you know, just his head, to see what was going on, and he was shot in the head and killed. And this was another stunning fact of her life, which had so many difficult moments, that her grandson, she wept when she told us this. So I was very, very moved by this story. And I also recognized the context, that the events that happened to her when she was a child are woven into the history and the reality of what Israel is today. And that's why it was so important to me.
Okay, thank you very much, Judith. The next thing we did was we went to the Mashain Yehuda Market in Jerusalem. It has food and drink, and we stopped at the falafel market, a falafel stand, to have lunch, and the guy behind the counter was just hilarious, and he put on a show for us with our falafel. The market also had lots of food and drink and people playing music and dancing and just all kinds of great things to look at and drool over. And they had wigs, and they had fabric store, and just all kinds of things. It was fascinating. All right. So this is day 8. Today was all about Jesus' life, which we experienced in reverse order, from the tomb to the cradle, so to speak. So the first place we went was the garden tomb. We gathered around the guide, who explained to us how they found the tomb, why they think that's the tomb, various things about where we were and what happened there. And this is the entrance to what they believe is the cave where Jesus' body was laid. There's some friends outside the tomb. And this is the cave where they believe Jesus' body was laid. You'll remember there was a rock in front of the hole, and it was rolled away, and Jesus' body wasn't there. All right. And so this is a cross, beautiful gate with a cross on it. Garden of Gethsemane. This is a picture of the garden with its ancient olive trees. It was, they're said to be possibly back to Jesus' time, and they were so old and gnarly. I think they probably were. This one especially. This is the church next door to the Garden of Gethsemane. It's called the Basilica of the Agony, or some call it the Church of All Nations. The beautiful sanctuary with domes. Okay, and then we drove to Bethlehem, where the Church of the Nativity is. And that's one of the towers for the Church of the Nativity, a spot where Jesus may have laid in the manger also. And that's the doorway into the Church of the Nativity. I'm not sure why. I think it was trying to mimic the cave that we went into, but it had to bend down. And it was very crowded. That's the sanctuary inside the church. And then when you get down to the lower level, that's where it is said that the manger lay. All right. So day 9, Sheila gave us a Hebrew lesson every day. Sheila was our guide. And she kept a reminder list for us in the front of the bus. About halfway through the tour, Sheila said she was naming our group the Sababas. And you'll notice that Sababa means great or awesome. We kind of like that name. All right. So after that, Okay, so on our way to Tel Aviv, we stopped at the Latrun Armor Museum, which houses tanks of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, from the many Israeli wars. And we had a young IDF soldier who acted as our guide and explained to us the different tanks they had and what war they were used in and how they worked exactly. And we had at least one person in our group who had the guts to climb up on top of one of them. And this is the wall of remembrance. It's got soldiers who've been lost in battle as their names. We got a really nice group photograph with some of the IDF soldiers inside the museum. And this is the unofficial greeter of the Latrun Museum. Then we went to Tel Aviv and saw the Taglit Innovation Center, and we heard about their breakthroughs in technology. A young lady who was explaining what all they have done at the Innovation Center. It was very interesting. Then we went to the Tel Aviv Market, where we explored the many stalls. We did a little shopping and had lunch. Lots of spices and candy. Some of us had a really nice lunch. And there was right across from where they were eating, there was a really good musician and a really not very good artist. And on the wall behind them is some graffiti. And we passed a guy who was working on some graffiti on the side of that wall. Then we drove to the old port of Jaffa, where there's a beautiful panoramic view of Tel Aviv from the park up on a little hill. This is bus number 1 with Tel Aviv in the background. Bus number 2 had the honor of a young bride who was being photographed there. She joined us for a picture with us, which is very nice. And finally, we had a farewell dinner at the modern restaurant in Israel, the Israel Museum. And so we have this is a picture of Maurice and Hussein, who were the drivers, and Karen and Shira, who were our guides. And now I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who's going to tell you a little story about Shira.
Okay, just a quick anecdote. A month or so after we got back to Alexandria, we held a virtual reunion, including Shira and Karen, and also Tamir, a reporter for Haaretz, a leading Israeli newspaper, and his wife Mira, who had done several talks at the adult ed on Sunday at Westminster. So as this was going on, Mira started asking Shira, the guide, why do you seem familiar? And it turned out that they'd both been in basic training together, and they'd been bunkmates there. So it's a small country in Israel.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, well, so then the last day was February the 26th, our day of departure from the airport. It was so moving, and I was just not feeling like I was ready to leave, so I didn't take any pictures that day, and I don't think Eric did either. But I would like to turn the microphone over to Dana Van Beaver Green, who's going to give some closing remarks.
Thank you, Sheila. It's been fun reminiscing with everyone. As Larry says, it's been over 6 months since we traveled to Israel. Of the many thrilling and profound experiences, there are 4 ways I was reliably affected. 2 were surprises, 1 I anticipated, but perhaps not as deeply as I experienced, and 1 is a lifelong treasure. I was surprised to feel 100% safe. We were expertly cared for, but beyond even that, I had imagined feeling a bit more like when I simply travel. It's just a little awareness, like when I'm walking the streets of London, New York, DC, and so forth. But instead, I felt an overwhelming, unseen presence guarding life. I was also surprised to see the joyful camaraderie of the young adults, no matter if they were in Western or habitual dress. There was much singing, laughter, and good-natured discussions in the streets. It was easy to access happiness. While I had anticipated a spiritual encounter traveling to this holy place, I didn't realize it didn't stem by visiting the tomb or other marked places, but more by simply breathing the guarded air in the setting marking the end of Jesus's life. Imagining the prayers, whispers, worry, unaccounted for or denied sleep there. I found it incredibly moving. Hearing the scripture read in various settings in Israel was also profoundly moving. And finally, I traveled, of course, with Judith. We've been happily together for decades. I'm the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, and Judith is Jewish. I know her family and have heard the stories, but traveling to Israel with Judith, the first time for each of us, and witnessing her reactions was intensely moving and precious.
Thank you, Dana. That was lovely. Well, I have to say thank you to everyone who helped with this presentation. Nedra Chahant. All right, let me see if I can get this fixed. Okay, there I am. Nedra Chahant, Janet Hawkins, David Wormser, Judith Van Beaver Green, Dana Van Beaver Green, and others who provided video and pictures and names to fill in the gaps. It was a team effort and a lot of fun putting this together, and we hope that you seeing it. And now I'd like to turn the mic over to Rabbi Jack Molin for our closing prayer.
Thank you, and this was a real pleasure to relive the trip. I will tell you, I got a little nervous at the beginning that it took us such a long time to get through the first day. And then just like on the trip, things went so quickly afterwards, it's hard to believe that it was the end already. So with that, let me share this with you. Please assume whatever posture is meaningful to you for prayer. Sovereign of the universe, in the Jewish community at the end of the holiest seasons, we always pray next year in Jerusalem. But what do we do in the year that our prayers were answered? What do we do when Jerusalem has been the location of our greatest joy? Well, as we all know from answered prayers, we pray all over again. So may it be your will that we have the privilege, individually and collectively, to once again celebrate next year in Jerusalem. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you very much. All right, now I turn it over to Nancy Hall-Behrens, and we're going to do a question and answer session.
Right. So first, I'd also like to say many thanks to all the trip participants and the leaders and who have joined us today, and special thanks to Sheila for organizing everything, and for Eric for all of the slides, or organizing the slides. I know they may have come from more than one person, but thank you to Sheila and Eric for coordinating today's program. So if you have any questions to ask of the panelists, if you could write your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom app, that would be great. And then I'll read them for the panelists to answer. And if you would like to use your gallery view during the Q&A time, that way you'll see all panelists sort of at the same time. So let's see what we have here. Okay. So, Louise Ball says, Sababa, truly.
Sababa.
Sababa, sorry.
Sababa.
Great.
We'll never forget that one, right?
Well, while I'm waiting for other questions, I have one question, and that is, were things like you imagined they were from having read the stories in the scriptures? Were things different? Obviously, they're modern things that are there that weren't there in biblical times, but was there something that you imagined it would have looked different, or that really was exactly the way you had imagined it?
I would say a number of us have talked about this, and you probably caught during my narrative that we took everything with a little bit of a grain of salt, because they would say, this is where the tomb is, this is where Jesus laid, this is where he was born, this is where the manger was. Okay, we were in Bethlehem, it was somewhere there, but whether they actually found the spot, we're skeptical. But it's okay. It was okay. We were enthralled with all of it.
And even if we had the right place, the location of Christ's crucifixion was an Arab transportation company's bus lot.
Yeah,
the wall around Jerusalem was built in the 1500s by the Ottoman Empire. Things are going to change in 2,000 years. So,
sure, right,
you could recognize the signs and some of the buildings and artifacts from the scripture, but it wasn't going to be the same.
No.
I think when we were in Jerusalem, there was so much of today around. So you would like go to and see a site, and then you would turn around and there'd be somebody selling something or whatever. There were a lot of tourists there. It was much more crowded than I think I imagined. So, but it's still amazing to see everything.
The first time Larry and I took this trip together, we were on the Damascus Road. And I said to Larry, we're on the Damascus Road, where Paul had his revelation and all that. And Larry said to me, yeah, I don't read the Bible geographically. So you react to the Holy Land in different ways. And the inspiration comes not so much from the physicality, but more, as Dana said, really from breathing in the air.
Mm.
And Jack's used that story against me for 15 years now.
And will continue to do so.
Yeah, and I still don't have a retort to it.
Well, one person along those lines, now the questions are coming in, that one person said that the Jordan River seemed, was a lot smaller than she had thought it would be. So I guess it's the same. How do you read? How do you read the Bible? How do you read stories and imagine, and the importance?
The river may be deep, but it is not wide.
Oh,
I think one of the things that struck me is the intimacy of the entire experience. And as it's been said, I mean, the whole of Israel can be compared to perhaps the state of New Jersey, maybe in that one way only, unless we talk about the Garden State. But it is, there is a reverence for much there. All the excavation, which continues to this point, there is a sense that you can peel back the layers of history and it's all important and it's all there. I found it extraordinary.
well, we have a question here that says, I'd like to hear from Rabbi Jack about how their friends in Israel are coping with COVID-19 and how it has affected the ultra-Orthodox community in Old Jerusalem.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer the second half of the question very well. There is a lot of resentment in Israel against the ultra-Orthodox community that has resisted the isolation and quarantine requirements because of their commitment to gathering for prayer and study. I think that despite the fact that their leadership has been really terrific about urging them to be mindful of the health requirements, just in general, healthcare in the ultra-Orthodox communities is not as well managed as it is in other communities. Israel has socialized medicine, so it isn't a question of access. It's just a question of what people are accustomed to. Look, COVID-19 was controlled in Israel, and then they reopened the schools and the beaches, and now it's not again. And so Israel is trying to cope with the challenges. I think I forget who it was that mentioned, Eric or whomever, that our guides haven't worked as guides since our trip. It's been 6 months that they've been unemployed in their particular field. And it's a gig economy in Israel. So there are lots of people doing other things than what they used to. But I don't have a friend or acquaintance in Israel whose livelihood has not been seriously damaged by the quarantine, because everything is integrated into the tourism industry and the high-tech industry. People just, they aren't working because it's such a social country, as you've heard. It's almost impossible to live a normal life there and keep the kind of distance that's necessary physically. It's a mess, and it is, I won't say it's as bad as it is here because there's less argument about some of the health concerns, but the leadership issue in Israel over this has been similar to the kinds of leadership issues we've had here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So one member of the audience would like Eric to retell his story about Shira. That I don't think that came through completely.
Okay, am I on now then?
Yes,
Okay,
I
good.
can hear you.
We were holding a virtual reunion of those who went on the trip, and also had our guides from Israel on the line too. And we had a couple from Israel. They're here because Tamir is a reporter for Haaretz and been in Washington, Alexandria for about a year, and then did some things with us at Westminster for people who were going on the trip or who were interested in learning more about Israel. So anyway, Shira's talking, and Mira, all of a sudden, the wife of the reporter, asks, "What's your last name?" And then they realized they'd been in the IDF together in basic training, and they'd been in the same bunk beds together. So it was kind of a only in Israel moment. But, you know, we've all had moments where we've been traveling somewhere, either in this country or overseas, and all of a sudden we run into somebody we know, you know, 1,000 miles away. But that was kind of a neat moment, and also kind of brought home what a closely knit community the country is, despite all the political issues we read about in the paper.
Right. Thank you, Eric. Appreciate that. Again, if anybody has any questions, we still have some more time, so be glad to have you write your questions to me. Meanwhile, I wanted to ask Jack and Larry, having gone several different times on this trip, or this type of trip, with different groups from the church and from Megiddo Sakim, was there something new and different that you learned? I mean, I know when I reread a book or when I go back to a new place, I always learn something new and different. What stood out for you in this trip that was new or different, or maybe you already knew it all in a good way?
Well, I'll go. I do have some issues with geography or just figuring out, you know, and remembering. But going the third time, I felt like a lot of it sank in for me, and particularly the places we visited again, you know, for the third time, the Yad Vashem and the Garden Tomb and things like that were really important. I think the overwhelming characteristic of this trip was nervousness at the outset, because the trip became so large. I mean, at one point we had 73 people signed up, and I think we ended up with 69 going. So it was 2 buses, 2 guides. It was much different, you know, than what we've had before. But we've always had really good guides, but these 2 were outstanding. And there was something about the group that, just as large as we were, that really bonded well together. And so it was a terrific trip, and we had our share of illness. None of it, all of it turned out okay. But there towards the end, we had about 7 or 8 people that were compromised pretty well, and none of it was coronavirus. But even that was managed well, and the group really surrounded the people. So I think the one thing I noticed different this time was, and this is probably just the passage of time, I think the politics and the Palestinian issue is so stalemated there. You didn't hear much conversation about that, whereas on the first trip there was a lot. And I felt much less presence of the IDF this time, just observably on prior trips. You see all these 18-year-olds dressed out in military uniforms, and really a very convivial and friendly group of people. But there was less of that noticeable to me this time too. And Jack, I don't know if you got any reflections on either of those things, but.
My standard for going on these trips is that there always has to be something new for me, because I've been so many times. The last thing I want is to get bored with going to Israel. And there were quite a number of places that we visited this time that I'd never been before. Some of them because they are new. The Innovation Center that Eric talked about that we went to on the last day, I'd never seen before. And sort of the other end of the spectrum, Magdala, where that excavation took place, is something that generally isn't on a Jewish trip, because, you know, Mary Magdalene is not of much concern when you go just with a group of Jews. But what was really remarkable for me this time, and maybe because my wife was with me for the first time in these 3 trips that I've taken with Westminster, is that it's hard for me to imagine now going back to Israel with just a Jewish group. The the variegated responses that come as a result of the religious and cultural integration that we had on this trip really deepened the experience for me in a way that it isn't that I haven't enjoyed and haven't found meaningful the trips that I took with the congregation, or trips I've taken with other rabbis, or trips that we've taken as just visitors. But there was a quality to this trip, not just because of its size and not just because of the camaraderie of the group, but because of the spiritual and cultural excellence of every experience.
I would add, I've only gone to Israel on these 3 trips, with Jack, and I can't imagine taking just a bunch of Christians to Israel. And I'm sure that the tour groups when Christian groups emphasize the Christian sites, and the Christian sites are obviously the newest sites there, but also just a smidgen of the history of the whole land and the region and the whole Bible. So I've always been appreciative of Jack going. And when we're both, I don't know what birthday this is of yours, but when I'm 95 and you're 98, we'll still be hobbling along taking these trips. I hope some of y'all can go too.
Yeah, we have a friend, or Anne has a friend from the Y, who was scheduled to go with her church group from, I think it's Church of the Good Shepherd. It's on Braddock Road. And she showed Anne her itinerary. And that particular itinerary, it was a Christian trip, had no stops in any of modern Israel. And it was all the Christian sites. They had an afternoon in Tel Aviv, was the only exposure to modern Israel that they had. And I just think that misses the point that the Holy Land is not sort of a biblical Disneyland. It is a living, breathing space that has been the home to remarkable history and a series of revelations over the course of centuries that continue right up to today. It didn't end in the first century of the Common Era.
Jack, there's a chat room question asking if either of us could speak to the panel of 4 women that we heard. And I know you had Anne do that when we were there, and I don't feel competent to speak to it. I don't know that you do either, but can you fill a little background on that?
Well, I'll say a few words about it, but only because my wife isn't in the room at the moment. These were 4 women who were invited to talk about the experience of being women in sort of emerging female consciousness in unlikely communities in Israel. That may not be a good way to describe it, but women who were ultra-Orthodox, either at some point in their life or currently, and who had leadership roles in the communities in which they find themselves now. And they talked about the role of women in Israeli society in a way that I think may have been surprising because of the notions that we have about how women, particularly in religious communities, are sometimes perceived to be relegated to the sidelines or to things that are not public. I have to be honest with you. I am not remembering that clearly enough to give you specifics, and maybe there's someone from among our group who could do that. But it was among the surprising things that we encountered when we were there.
I have a question. I was wondering why we didn't go into, I guess what I would consider Old Jerusalem more, and we didn't get to see the Temple Mount or anything. Are we not allowed to go over there? Is that really what it was?
The Temple Mount is a sometimes difficult place.
I figured, okay.
The Temple Mount specifically, and especially since there is access construction going on. That means that everybody would have to funnel through a particularly contentious spot
Mhm.
on the Temple Mount. But part of the reason we didn't spend more time in Old Jerusalem is, look, you could spend days exploring the nooks and crannies of the old city, but it's not a place where a group of 68 people can comfortably gather, because if you'll remember when we were there, the roads are narrow and the activity is frantic sometimes. And yeah,
It wasn't safe. It wasn't safe for us, right?
no, it isn't a question of not safe. It's not accessible, I think is the right word.
Okay.
In a small group, it is a wonderful place to explore. But a small group would not quite get the sense of Beit Shan or Caesarea, where we were, by nature of the fact that we were a group and accommodated so well, we had a greater appreciation of that than somebody standing alone in an empty amphitheater would have.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you.
So I do have a comment here from somebody who has also who also went on the trip. And she says that the pictures were really wonderful, and thank you for that. She also wanted to lift up the high quality of the many speakers that were arranged for your group on a number of current day issues. So I'm wondering if any of you have any of those that you'd like to highlight, or were any of them ones that particularly were meaningful to you?
I think just to speak, for the group, I know that there was a tremendous eye-opening experience in our group listening to the woman describing the conditions in Syria. And that happened early in the trip. It was, as Sheila said, the coldest hour that we had together. I mean, we were on a windy hill, huddled together, and it was just very, very cold. But a quick run through of the history and just the conditions that the Syrian refugees face now was a heaviness to the day and to the trip that has probably lingered, because it's not gone away.
So I would echo what Larry just said. Was her name Miri Eisen? Is that the right name? Did I get that right? Okay, so I would say I'm originally from Boston, and that was the coldest hour of my entire life. Like, it was so cold that I didn't even know anywhere but the Antarctica got that cold. It wasn't just cold, the wind was ferocious. And so I really didn't stay right there. I was listening from a place where there was, like, I don't know, some tree or something to try to protect myself because I was so freezing. However, one of the things that I loved about what I heard from what she said is it made it so clear how sharp the people are in Israel that are doing this kind of analysis of the political issues and the refugee issues. And even though I think she had been like a military analyst or had been a government analyst, I found her to be remarkably, I don't know if I would say objective, but she wasn't focused on any particular side. She was being very analytical about the way she described it. And I found that really impressive. I mean, that was not a woman that I would ever dare to get into an argument with, because she would win by a long shot. She was so smart and so analytical. I just found that particular hour that we spent, even though it was cold, and I'm not kidding, it was really telling, not only for what she said, but for her whole approach.
Thank you for that. Any other So we're sort of near the end of our time, but
Forgive me for interrupting. I have a hard stop at 1:15. So thank you all. And next year in Jerusalem.
Thank you, Jack. Good to see you.
thank you. Thank you.
I'll join you.
And I have another question here. Did any of the presenters speak about the history of Islam on Palestine and Israel from the 17th century to today? What are the core issues today that are the apparent standoff between the PLO and Jews? Anyway, that whole question, the political side. Did you have any speakers that addressed those historical? And Dave, I know you've done a lot of background reading on some of the history, but I don't want to put you on the spot if somebody else wants to answer that.
I did do a lot of reading before we went. The trip really didn't focus on the Palestinian issues or the Palestinian-Israeli relations. And if I were to do the trip again, I'd look for something that gave me more of that background. We crammed an amazing amount of stuff, places, information, lectures. I mean, it was fabulous. But that was one area that I could have stood to have a little bit more. We really didn't touch on it. Our guide, Sheila, made some comment about at one point how when she was in college, she was cooking with a Palestinian and an Orthodox Jew, and how they had tried to grow some bonds together. And she had some hopes on that basis that if people would develop interpersonal relationships, some of these issues would resolve themselves or at least become less contentious. But that's about as deep as it got.
I think one of the things about having a slideshow is it does give you a taste. But what it doesn't do is, of course, you don't just see this and see that. There's a whole experience around it. And so the conversations that we had and the little side stories that our guide gave us and the talks, like for instance, I'm not somebody that would normally go to a military museum, but yet I found it very fascinating about the tanks and where these where people had tried to get their hands on some way to help them, and some people came through. Some countries did, some countries didn't. Some they gave a lot of money to some people and didn't get it. They got old things that they refurbished. It was fascinating, and the sheer will of survival in that country is a beautiful, beautiful thing to watch. But it's the survival of many peoples.
Thank you for that, Dana. Any closing remarks or last highlights or observations any of the panelists wanted to offer?
I would say that from talking to people who've been on this trip previously, they all seem to be a little bit different. This one went to the north. I will guess that the fourth trip will go to the south more and see different things. I know that in the past they did get to speak with high Palestinian officials. I was amazed at the quality of the people we got to talk to. I mean, if you went to London on a trip, you would not be meeting with people of this background, whether you were in a group of 70 people or, just you and me. So I thought that the trip worked out very nicely.
Thank you. Yeah, and you all were terrific. I mean, I want to say that about the program today, but also just everyone on the screen or everyone on the call that was on the trip. And thanks to those of you who are not on the trip for just watching. It looks like we had about 52, 53 people.
Yes, that's great. And it is being recorded, so it will be available on the church website, and not right away, but once it's posted, it'll be available. And the last question we have here is a comment that I just it echoes what I was going to say. Just wanted to say thank you to everyone for this presentation and the Q&A. It was wonderful. And it really was. And thank you, Sheila, for getting it all.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks to each of you.
Pleasure.
Really
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Thank you all. And
lovely to see you.
Yeah. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. We're ready to go again.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Thank you.